Hello everyone, I am Mekala Ramesh, work for the products BizTalk 360 and Atomic Scope in Covey.co as a lead product consultant. Elizabeth will deliver the day's next session. She has already been a part of the virtual conference, but this is her first in-person appearance. So it's amazing to have her here to show how one can modernize the API stack with GraphQL and Azure API Management. But before we begin, let me tell you about her favorite hobbies. She enjoys traveling, crafting, singing, and so on. And she wants the ability to see into the future so that she may help prevent bad things from happening. So that being said, it's time to hand over the floor to her. Welcome.
Hello, everyone. It's so funny, that walk-on song. Everyone that's been going up kind of feels like you're either a baseball player or a rock star, especially with the mic, so it's been really fun to watch. Thank you all for being here. I'm very excited to be here. How many of you, is this your first Integrate conference? Cool, a lot of you. So as was mentioned before, this is my first in-person conference. I'm very excited to be here. Adrian Hall, for those of you who are joining virtually, will be in the chat, hopefully, fingers crossed. He was having some issues joining. But so if you answer questions in the chat, either I'll get to them later or Adrian will be able to answer them for you during the presentation. So I'm a PM on Azure API Management. I'm going to first kind of run down a few of the recent product updates that we've had, and then I'm going to do a deep dive into how you can use GraphQL to modernize your API stack. So how many of you are familiar with GraphQL? Cool, good amount of you. So hopefully for those of you who don't, I'll be able to teach you something new. So without further ado, let's get started. So we'll start with some product updates. So we have a bunch of things in public preview. I'll just quickly run through them. So first and foremost, we have authorizations. It simplifies the process for managing authorization tokens to OAuth 2 backends. This enables APIs to be exposed with or without a subscription key. So currently you need to have a subscription key to expose your API to consumers, but with authorizations, that's not necessary. Next, we have private link integration. I think Logic Apps was talking a bit earlier about private link and how it works for them. But for us, it basically enables your clients to, in your private network, to securely access your management instance over Azure Private Link. And this feature is available in all tiers except for consumption. So it provides a really cost-effective solution for private networking without the really heavy cost of premium instances with VNet. Next up, we have managed certificate support, which is a security feature. It takes the pain out of managing custom domains, and it provides free auto-provisioned certificates for custom domains provisioned by Azure API Management. So it kind of takes the pain out of having your own custom host name and takes some of the work out of doing that for yourself. Last but not least, in public preview, we have synthetic GraphQL APIs, which I'll be digging into a little bit more later. And this allows you to easily create a GraphQL API based on your existing HTTP, SOAP, or REST APIs. So you can use your existing REST APIs, your existing kind of infrastructure, and build a new GraphQL service on top of it. So we have a bunch of things that are generally available since we last spoke. I'm going to kind of dig into a few of them, not going to call them all out, although you can learn about all of these and any of our other updates on our Azure Updates page. There'll be a link at the end with a bunch of resources, any resource about getting started with API management, as well as a link to our Azure Updates page. And so first of all, I'm going to call out the support for Azure Event Grid. This was also mentioned just before the presentation before me. You learned a little bit about Azure Event Grid. We're now integrating with them. So basically, you can automate your workflows and processes and use API management actions as triggers for that. We also have GA support for managing both WebSocket and GraphQL type APIs. So this is existing GraphQL services that you want to expose to your consumers. Essentially, you can import them into API management as APIs. You can apply all the great management features that you know and love and expose them to your consumers. And this works towards our mission to kind of provide support for all API types for a full API platform. And lastly, we have some improvements that allow further customizations for the developer portal. So as you're exposing your APIs to your consumers, whether it's internal or external consumers, we have some new features like injecting custom HTML code or improved open API support that helps make that easier for you. So with that being said, I'm going to dig down into GraphQL. So I'm going to kind of paint the picture of a lot of you are familiar, most of you, all of you should be familiar with REST. So I'll kind of paint the picture. REST, we know and love it, but it's not always the best for modern applications. So here's kind of where it falls short. First of all, it requires many calls to serve a single component. So when you have a front-end application that requires many calls and a lot of data, that becomes very costly, and it kind of leads to performance issues. Additionally, with REST, it's really guilty of overfetching and underfetching information. So when you call an endpoint, you don't really get to choose what comes back. You get the whole endpoint and all the data along with it. So you kind of have to parse out what you need, and then also you have to kind of throw away data that you just called. So it's not the most efficient. And it's also, in general, just inefficient for modern client-side development. Let me kind of give you an example that will kind of outline this for you. So this is just the Microsoft store. You all should know and love it. So there's a few different places on this page. On the left, there's kind of a bunch of these different sections, and then there's little icons for all of them, and then there's also a few sections of apps with a bunch of metadata about them. So let's look at that top section. So for this section, you'd have to make at least 2 separate calls to get both the categories and the icons. And then when we look at this top section, we'd have to make a lot of calls. We had to make one for the name of the apps, all within entertainment. We'd have to make calls for the ratings, for the price, for the icon, for all of the different things. So this kind of is continuing to add up. You can see this already happening. And then when we take this bottom section, you get even more. So it's, again, those more calls for all of these different components. So even with a web page that's not the most complex, you can see how this kind of starts to build upon itself and become a little bit more heavy than we're maybe hoping for our basic application. So with that being said, let me some of you know what GraphQL is, but for those of you who don't, like REST, it's an HTTP protocol, but it allows you to make a single call to a single endpoint. So you call once and you get all the information you need and nothing more, nothing less. And this optimizes the bandwidth to an application and reduces the different calls that you need to take, that you would need to take in REST. And it reduces it to a single call. It acts as a layer between the client and the backend. And GraphQL can be extremely secure because rather than authorizing on a single endpoint, you can authorize down to the field level. So if there's certain fields that need to be secured and not public to the user, you can authorize them at that level rather than having to block a whole endpoint. So who's using GraphQL? Well, at Microsoft, there's a few products you might know that are using GraphQL. Mostly Yammer and Teams are ones you probably are familiar with. They all use GraphQL for their backends. And additionally, GitHub and LinkedIn are also running on GraphQL. So it's something that Microsoft's investing in and something that we find really important moving forward. Additionally, there's this thing called the GraphQL Foundation. These are all the companies that are part of it, and they contribute to the standards of GraphQL as a language. As you can see, Microsoft is one of those companies. So we're really looking into investing in GraphQL as the future of APIs, especially for modern application development. So let's take a look at that Microsoft Store page yet again. But this time, let's look at what that could look like, what the calls could look like if we were to use GraphQL instead of REST. So on this left side shows an example of what a single query could look like for this page. So you have a couple different queries in one call. One that's getting the categories and the name and the icon. Another one that's getting apps for the category entertainment. with all the name, rating, image, and price. And then there's also this get apps, another one with the category utility, and this is also getting the name, rating, image, and price. You can also usually place a limit on that, so you can limit, oh, I only want the top, in this example, there's the top 6 on the top part. So as you can see, rather than having those tens of calls with REST, you can have a single call, a query to your GraphQL endpoint and get all this information back you need. So GraphQL is a protocol that developers love, and that's one of the many reasons that we really recommend investing in it. So the first reason they love it is because it has introspection, and this allows developers to discover the resources available to them in the GraphQL schema. So they can explore the schema, they can learn about the different fields and queries and types, and this makes it really easy for them to onboard and also build on top of their existing queries that they may be using. Additionally, it's auto backwards compatible. This basically means that the front end won't be broken every time the API gets updated. Rather than changing the endpoint itself and kind of breaking existing calls, it's very focused on not making breaking changes, and rather than changing existing types and queries, it just adds new ones. Additionally, client generation is a big thing with GraphQL. This means that test queries can be sent via clients like Graphical, which we'll see a little bit of later, and also Insomnia. These are some popular engines I'll show you later, but it basically has built-in documentation. You can run test queries, and it's native to the language. Again, this is self-documenting, so all queries, mutations, subscriptions, types, all of the above is automatically documented in the GraphQL schema, and then when you generate a client, this can be then explored by any of the users. Additionally, GraphQL supports real-time updates. So whenever the query result changes, the server can return new results to the client. So this is something that's kind of in progress for us, but is something that's present in the GraphQL community. So you might be wondering, if you haven't used GraphQL before, how do I implement this? Sure, I'm sold, but how do I make this happen? So if you're starting from scratch, you can create a GraphQL server. This could be using a tool like Apollo, or there's lots of tools out there like Tyke Apollo, and you create it from scratch, and you write the schema, you write the backend, you do it all at once. The next option is to combine your existing REST endpoints. So this would be aggregating them into a single endpoint. You just need to create a GraphQL schema and then map those endpoints to the points in that schema so that the data gets served. Finally is the server plus augmentation route. This is combining the first two options. So if you have an existing GraphQL server and you have some other information you want to include from other endpoints, you can put those endpoints, attack them onto the schema, and resolve those using resolvers so that the data gets served when those queries get called. With all three of those, there's 3 steps that you need to take. First of all, you need to start with a schema. This basically outlines what the different types are and also how the information gets processed. There's also these resolvers who they basically, for if there's a type, if you're trying to serve data to this certain field, that resolver says where that information comes from, what endpoint, what API, that type of thing. Additionally, you need to link those resolvers to the data sources. So that's actually linking it to those APIs. So as I kind of hinted at earlier, there's 2 different implementations and 2 different levels of GraphQL support and API management. The first one is just GraphQL pass-through, and this is support for existing GraphQL APIs. You can import them into API management as an API from your existing GraphQL endpoint. You can import your schema, and API management just acts as the management layer and the governance layer on top of that API, so you can expose it to your consumers. Additionally, we have synthetic GraphQL, where API management actually acts as the GraphQL service. So with this, you can take your existing backend APIs, you take your open APIs, your HTTP triggers and logic apps and function apps. You can combine those into a schema and set resolvers so you can build your GraphQL service with those endpoints. So I'm going to jump into a bit of a demo. I am not as brave as the rest of many of my other speakers, and it is slightly pre-recorded, but I will be talking over it. So yeah, we're gonna jump into it. I'm gonna basically show you an example. I'm gonna be using, there's a bunch of free to use GraphQL APIs out there. I happen to use SpaceX because rocket ships are cool. So I'm going to be building an app using a SpaceX API. I'm going to be using API management to make it production ready, and then I'm going to add some special stuff to it from my Logic app endpoint. So I'll be showing you how to do that. So this is your graphical explorer that I was mentioning earlier. On the left-hand side, you can see all the different queries, and in the middle is the test console, and the right side is a little documentation page that has all your queries, mutations, and subscriptions. So you see I can send a test query, I get back all this information, I ask for certain data, that's the data and fields I get back, and I'm just kind of exploring the different documentation for this API. And once I'm done exploring, I'm going to go into Azure API Management. I can go to the APIs page, and I can import a new GraphQL API. So I'll click that tile right there. And basically, we have the option, you just add a display name and an GraphQL API endpoint. That's all you need to add. You also have the option to optionally upload a schema. This means you have control over the schema you expose. So even if your endpoint exposes your whole schema, you don't need to expose that to your consumers, because as you can imagine, that can get, when all of your consumers can see your entire schema, that could become a security issue, which I'll get into later. So you can have a protection layer between your actual schema and the schema you expose. So once that's uploaded, you can see in the front end tab, you can explore the different parts of the schema, similar to in graphical. And I can go over to the test console, and I can actually test it and make sure that it's imported properly. Fingers crossed. It's not like I know how this ends. But yeah, I can do the same, similar to graphical. We tried to keep it as close to graphical as possible. It's the industry standards, and we wanted to make sure that we weren't blocking any existing graphical customers. It worked, so I did something right. So now I'm thinking, yes, my GraphQL API works, but what if I wanted to add some security features? This isn't quite production ready. I'm not sure my backend will be totally secure. So what I can do is I can go to the policy editor, and I want to add a policy in the inbound scope. So we have this new policy, it's validate GraphQL request. And this allows you to not only validate your GraphQL request against the schema, but it also allows you to add authorization. You can define the maximum depth of your query, so how many edges of your of the schema it calls, and then how large and complex the query can be. So I set a max depth and a max size. I'm limiting it so that people can't go crazy and DDoS my server. And then I'm going to add a rate limiting policy, just a simple one. I'm going to limit the number of calls, again, so my server can't be taken down when someone tries to go crazy and send a bunch of queries. So once I submit that, and this is in our form-based editor, so if you don't want to use code, there's a good amount of policies where you don't have to use any code. It's a low-code option. And I've added those policies. I'm going to test it and make sure it's working properly. So I'm just going to make a simple query, and I'm going to click it. If I click it enough times, I get this status code 429 back, and it says rate limit is exceeded, and I have to wait a certain amount of time. So it's working. This means someone can't go crazy and send a bunch of queries and take down my server. So now what I'm going to do is going to create a really large query and see if I can hit that limit. If someone's trying to get a bunch of information about these rocket capsules, I want to make sure that maybe they don't do that. So this says, oh, I get a status code 400 back, and this query's body is too large. It exceeds the limit. So I say, oh, got to send a smaller query. I can also look at the trace, and I can kind of examine what it looked like, go into the back end, where it went wrong. In this case, I kind of know what went wrong, but sometimes you need to dig a little deeper. So it's really useful for troubleshooting. And then when I make a smaller query, I get the information back that I asked for. So with just a couple policies, I was able to secure my API a little better. So now I have this logic app that basically serves photos from an Azure storage blob. And I want to use that to be able to serve photos of these rocket ships when I call the information for my GraphQL schema. So I want to be able to get all this information and also a photo of the rocket for my nice little SpaceX website. This is a little picture of what the logic app looks like. I don't have the fancy new UI, so that's fun. But yeah, it basically just appends to a string variable, so I'll get a string with the path and the URL of that JPEG that I'm looking for. So I found the rocket type, and I'm going to first edit the schema and add a new photo field that will be, and I'm defining it as a string so that it's expecting to return a string. And then I can go to the back end and I can define a resolver. So this needs to be defined before the base policy is applied, and I'm defining it for type rocket and field photo, and I'm setting the method to a post and to that operation of my logic app that I imported into API management. So now I'm going to go test and see if it's working. Had to make up my mind. There we go. So I want to go see what the photo of the Falcon Heavy looks like. So I'm typing in that ID. I'm having to return the ID and the photo. And when I send that, I get back that ID back and also this URL. And then if I actually copy that URL, I can paste it into my browser and get back the photo. So with just a few minutes, I was able to not only secure my existing GraphQL API, but also add some additional data to it and add more information from this logic app and basically just augment my existing service. So I can make a cooler app because no one likes to look at an app with just text. So now I can have an app that has pictures, and there's kind of no limit of what you can do. If you can make an HTTP trigger to do it, then you can attach your GraphQL API, you can send a resolver, and you can service that information to your front-end application. So I hope that gave you a little picture of what you can do. We're continuing to invest in GraphQL in the future. We don't have a public roadmap for it, but just know that we are continuing to invest in it. And I mentioned security was a big issue, and there's kind of these top 5 OWASP GraphQL security issues, and API management is able to mitigate all of them. So the first one is data leakage versus via introspection. And this was something that I mentioned before. If you're able to kind of look into the schema, you can actually write an introspection query that says, I'm looking for this, and it'll send back your fields. And that can get a little sketchy when you're just a normal user that's trying to maybe have bad intent and dig into the schema and find information that you shouldn't have access to. So with API management, you can actually enable and disable introspection, so this prevents that from happening. Next is route change. With GraphQL, there's some pretty common /GraphQL paths that are kind of the default of what people use, so it makes it pretty easy to spoof those endpoints, and it makes it an attack, or it makes it a target for attack. And since API management creates an API proxy for your GraphQL API, this makes it a different endpoint that's maybe not as easy to attack and target as the existing endpoint. Additionally, authentication is a big thing with GraphQL. You should always have different layers of authentication, not only different JOT tokens, but also on the field level, and GraphQL can kind of be, just like other APIs, it should be authenticated properly. And in API management, we have a bunch of authorization policies built in. We have the ones that were existing, and then we also have the GraphQL specific ones. So we have a bunch of different layers of security you can add. You can also use private networking. You can do all kinds of things. Next, we have query depth and complexity. I showed you how you could use that validate GraphQL request policy to place a limit on how complex those queries could be. And when you have a really complex query, it puts a real burden on your backend, and it can create room for a DDoS attack. So that's never fun. And you don't want that to happen and bring down your backend. So I showed you that policy. That makes it really easy to set a limit on how complex the queries can be. And finally, we also have a schema generation. So it's really, if you automatically generate your schema just based on your endpoint, it makes it really easy to see, this is all the different fields that are available to me. But with API management, you can choose the schema you expose. So rather than exposing all the fields, you can only expose the ones that you want. It doesn't change your endpoint, it just changes what the client can see and query. So I'm gonna walk through some key takeaways. First one is that you can use GraphQL without losing your backend investments. So you already have these kind of legacy backends, these SOAP and REST APIs. You don't want to completely get rid of them. It's a lot of work gone. You can use them and still move into the future with new API types. So you can use them and still have a single endpoint you can call and make really great modern applications. And also, production GraphQL is easier and more secure with Azure API Management. I showed you just a few of the security features we have. There's much more. All of the security features you know and love for API management are all available for GraphQL APIs. So it makes it really easy to be production ready and make sure your APIs are secure for production. So to learn more, we have this ak.ms link that'll take you to all of our information about API management. It's a whole list of resources. I recently added a section specifically on GraphQL. So there's some resources in there, some information about getting started, and then some information from the GraphQL Foundation. So if you're interested in learning more about GraphQL as a whole, we're not the only people participating in it. There's a whole community. So feel free to check out those links. And also with any kind of questions, feedback, there is our email for our whole PM team. If you send an email, someone from the PM team will respond. Usually within 24 hours, we're pretty good about it. So yeah, that's all I have for content. I don't know how much time I have for Q&A, but thank you. There shouldn't be too much. The question was if there's any latency with wrapping an existing REST API with GraphQL, or existing REST API with GraphQL. There shouldn't be too much latency. I don't have exact numbers. There might be a minute amount because there is some processing that happens, but it shouldn't be something that affects performance.
The example you showed, was there a graph server like Apollo you said, or was API doing the job?
Yeah, so that was an example of both. So I had that existing GraphQL API that was running on a server. I think it might have been running on Apollo. That's an API you can use yourself. If you Google GraphQL APIs, there's a Star Wars API, there's a SpaceX API. You can test them out, use them for free. I think GitHub's is also available. You just have to get a subscription key. But so that one was running on an existing server, and then when I added the logic app and set that resolver, that was API management kind of acting as a server again to augment that. Any other questions? Before I turn it into my own stand-up routine. Cool.
Anybody?
Speak now or forever. Oh.
Slightly off topic, but do you happen to know if the Dataverse team will be offering a GraphQL?
I'm not sure about that. I know we're talking to the Dataverse team and working on integrating with them, but I don't have any specific details. Yes.
Yeah, I saw that there is an existing a NuGet library that's called GraphQL.net. Do you recommend using that one for start? Oh, sorry. Okay, I can take my question again.
No, you're fine.
I saw that there is an existing NuGet library that is called GraphQL.net. Is that something that you guys are helping developing, or is it something standalone?
Yeah, so that's not from API management directly. I guess they could hear it because you're on the microphone. I was going to repeat the question, sorry. But yeah, that's not something that API management team provides, but it is a partner team that is working on developing that, and all of the teams that are working on GraphQL and Microsoft are working pretty closely. So, I mean, I wouldn't be a Microsoft employee if I didn't say to try it out. But I will say that Apollo also has some really, if you're just looking to get started with GraphQL, it has some really good tutorials about kind of how to create a server. So if it's your first time trying it out, I'd really recommend that. I'm not as familiar with the GraphQL.net, but I know there's a lot of cool tools specifically with .NET, and they've been doing a lot of research to help improve that too.
Thank you.
Pass the mic.
Yeah. What about if we have two different types of responses, like JSON and XML? Can GraphQL handle that?
Yeah, so additionally, there's also a policy in API management to transform the response from XML to JSON and vice versa. So I think GraphQL mostly works with JSON, but it shouldn't be an issue.
I mean, if in the same query we have two different responses, so can GraphQL handle that?
I think so. I'll have to get back to you on that one.
Okay,
Not
thanks.
100%. Thank you.
Please, plenty of time, so if you like, Mr. proceed.
Also, any questions about API management in general?
So a roadmap question. You mentioned private endpoint on APIM Gateway. And I'm not sure when you talk about inbound, is it inbound from client to APIM front end? And in which case, what do I do if I've got back-end services that are currently connected to my VNet? Or does it do both? Or have I got it the wrong way around and it's for talking to my back-end APIs?
That is a great question.
You can see the confusion, right? 'Cause you just said inbound.
No,
It's like
no, you're
inbound
totally
in which
fine.
direction?
Yeah, I believe that it's both, or if not, we're supporting one and we'll support the other soon. It's just in preview right now, so I know there's some more features we're rolling out. So if it is just for inbound, then outbound will be part of the GA release.
Just a very small ask. So you know, APIM comes in the STV1 and STV2 platform versions. Is there any plans to make the provisioning by preference the STV2 platform controllable from like the Bicep API plane? Because at the moment, I think you've got to have like spit, turn around 3 times, spit over your shoulder, and sacrifice a goat or something, and then you've got STV2. Otherwise, it always defaults to STV1. Is there any plans to make that a little bit more controllable anytime soon?
Yeah, that's some great feedback. I'm not positive on our plans for tooling-wise, specifically through Bicep, but that is some feedback I can take the team.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Where?
Oh, I don't know.
Is it something we are going to see in Dynamics 365 for composing?
Sorry.
Is it something we are going to see it in Dynamics 365 for composing entities instead of like having this in Dynamics itself?
That feature in Dynamics, I can't speak specifically for the Dynamics team. I don't know what they're working on. If you ask them nicely, maybe. Anybody else? Yeah, cold call. Cool. Any other questions? Yeah.
Hi, this is a general APIM question, and it's about the cause policy. It doesn't seem that you can do a wildcard in there. Is that something that's going to happen?
You should be able to if you do an asterisk.
Didn't the last time I tried.
That's great
Which
feedback.
made it really tricky if you want your whole domain to...
Yeah, that's great feedback. That might be a bug. I will consider it filed.
Thank you.
Same for the function app, the stick doesn't work.
Oh, it's the same for function apps? That's the feedback for the functions team. I don't know who's here, but Yeah, so the question was what's in GA and what's in preview. So in GA is support for existing GraphQL APIs to actually import that into API management. That, as well as the validate GraphQL request policy, is all in GA. The augmentation piece, so the synthetic GraphQL, building a server, adding on top of your existing server, that is in preview. I'm not positive when GA is targeted for, but work is happening. Thanks. Love to hear it. Cool. Thank you, folks.
Covey.co